They came for her at sunrise on a Tuesday in June. 6 ICE agents, 4 black Suburbans. Badges angled just enough that you couldn't read the numbers from 10 feet away. And a supervisor named Rory Kellerman. He had decided 2 weeks earlier over a bad cup of coffee in a government break room that the black woman at 1408 Sycamore Lane had gotten too comfortable on his street. He thought she was nobody. He thought she was easy. He thought 4 vehicles on a dead-end cul-de-sac at 6:47 in the morning meant he had already won before she ever opened her front door. He had no idea who he was standing on the porch of. He had no idea that the woman in the faded army sweatshirt holding a coffee cup was one of 7 women in the entire history of the United States military ever cleared for her specific operational billet. He had no idea that somewhere in a quiet office in Virginia, a list existed with her name on it, and that when certain things happened to the people on that list, certain other people woke up. He had no idea that his warrant, his badges, his authority, and his certainty would become the most expensive decision of his life. Stick around, because when the people who trained him come to collect on what Rory Kellerman did that morning on Sycamore Lane, it is the most complete federal destruction I have ever covered on this channel. And it starts the way all the best ones do, with a woman who did not run. The house was brick, single story, with a good roof and a maple tree in the front yard that turned the color of a stop sign every October. Marci Ellington had paid for it in cash, not because she was wealthy, but because she was a woman who had spent 23 years in the United States Army. And in all that time, she had never once had occasion to spend money on anything except the things she absolutely needed, which were very few, and which did not include a second rocking chair, or decorative anything, or the kinds of small luxuries that most people accumulate without thinking. She was 47 years old. She had a garden with tomatoes and 1 rose bush she hadn't entirely figured out yet. She had a Ford Bronco in the driveway with a gold star sticker on the back bumper. The kind of symbol that means something was sacrificed, that someone gave their life so someone else could go home. She had a daughter named Jasmine who called every Sunday at 6 o'clock from Memphis. Jasmine was finishing nursing school with the kind of focus that made Marci proud in a way she rarely put into words. She had a coffee maker that she ran once in the morning and not again. She had the particular kind of stillness that settles into a person who has spent a long time listening for things that might kill them, and has finally, for the first time in decades, found a place quiet enough to stop listening. Marci had moved to Willow Bend, Tennessee, not for the postcard kind of peace, but the real kind. The deep-pillowed, hard-earned quiet that a soldier decides they are owed after enough years of the other thing, after 30 years of operations in places where peace was a luxury, where silence meant someone had won, where the ability to anticipate violence was the difference between coming home and not coming home at all. The neighbors had been what neighbors always are in a small Tennessee cul-de-sac, friendly on the surface, curious underneath, and slow to close the last inch. Harriet Donnelly lived 2 doors down, a Vietnam widow with white hair and a coffee cup permanently in her hand. She had closed that last inch on day 3 by walking over with a jar of her own honey and a look that said she had already decided Marci was going to be fine. Some women recognize other women who have already paid the price for their country, and Harriet was that kind of woman. Emmett Hawkins lived across the street, a retired postal worker in a Tennessee Volunteers cap. He had closed it on day 8 by asking if she needed help with her gutters, which she didn't. But she said yes because she understood the offer for what it was, an invitation. A signal that she belonged. The Baxters lived next door. They had a 16-year-old named Cody who walked a rescue beagle named Mayor twice a day and never forgot to say ma'am. That had been enough. The rest of the street she knew by their cars and their curtains, by the rhythm of their mornings, by what kind of people they were when no one was watching. That was the right amount of community, not intrusive, not distant, just enough. On the morning that everything changed, Marci was on her knees in the tomato bed before the sun cleared the power lines. She was in the faded army sweatshirt and a pair of canvas pants worn thin at the knees from exactly this kind of work. Her hands were working the soil without her looking at them. The way a musician plays a scale without looking at the keys. She was thinking about Jasmine. She was thinking about the phone call last Sunday. It had run 47 minutes instead of the usual 40. Jasmine had sounded tired in the good way. The way people sound when they have been working hard at something they chose, something that matters to them. Marci was thinking about what she might cook if Jasmine drove up next weekend. The pecan thing that Jasmine pretended not to like but always ate 2 servings of. She was thinking about whether she should plant the roses in a different spot, somewhere with more afternoon sun. She was thinking about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of luxury. Peaceful, scattered. The thoughts of someone who finally had time to think about small things. She did not hear the first SUV turn onto Sycamore Lane. She heard the second in the way you hear something when there is no reason for it to be there. The third she felt more than heard, because by then 3 engines were idling at the mouth of a dead-end street at 6:47 in the morning. And a woman who had spent 23 years reading situations before they became situations had already set down her trowel. She rose slowly. She brushed the dirt from her knees. She walked without hurrying to her porch steps, climbed them, and picked up the coffee mug she had left on the railing 20 minutes earlier. She took one slow sip. Still warm. Good. She had learned long ago that small comforts mattered, that a moment of warmth, of normalcy, of routine could anchor you when everything else was breaking apart. She took a breath. Then she looked down her driveway. 4 black Chevy Suburbans. They had arranged themselves in perfect containment formation. 1 blocking the driveway mouth, 1 blocking the cul-de-sac exit, 2 pulled diagonally across the street in an X pattern that prevented escape in any direction. It was the formation she had designed. It was the formation she had taught to operators whose names were now on a wall in Virginia. A wall maintained by the Defense Department. A wall that listed the names of the people who had died so that America could sleep at night. She looked at that formation and she felt something settle into her shoulders like a heavy coat. Not fear. She had learned in her 20s that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not panic. Panic was for people who didn't understand what was happening. She understood. She understood perfectly. She understood that someone had decided she did not belong here. She set the coffee cup back on the railing. She placed her hands, palms forward. Where everyone could see them, she was completely still, waiting. The way she had waited in places where waiting meant the difference between life and death. Supervisor Rory Kellerman was 51 years old, gray crew cut, broad across the shoulders in the way of a man who had once been genuinely strong and was now just thick. He had been with ICE for 19 years. He had been passed over for the regional director position twice. The second time was 6 months before the morning on Sycamore Lane. He had been told in a meeting he would never forget that the selection committee had concerns about his judgment. He had driven home from that meeting, poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon before he took off his jacket, and sat at his kitchen table thinking about what the word judgment meant, when used about a man who had spent 19 years doing a job that very few other people had the stomach for. He had interrogated suspects. He had conducted raids. He had separated people from their families. He had seen things that broke most people. And he had done them anyway, because someone had to do them. And he was the kind of man who did what needed doing. The kind of man who didn't flinch. The committee had not understood what judgment meant in that context. The committee had looked at his record and seen something they didn't like. The committee had used a word that hollowed him out. He did not consider the possibility that the committee had been right. What he did instead was build a quiet arrangement. He had known for 3 years a mid-level administrator at a private detention contractor called Brightstone Holdings, a company that ran 6 facilities across 4 states under Department of Homeland Security contracts, a company that made money from detention, that profited from arrest, that turned human suffering into quarterly earnings reports. The arrangement was simple. Kellerman directed arrests to Brightstone facilities. Brightstone paid money into 4 separate LLCs registered in Delaware. The accounts were in the names of his wife's brother, his college roommate, his neighbor's adult son, and a shell entity called Sycamore Valley Consulting, LLC. He had named the last one with the blunt irony of a man who thought no one was watching, after the street where he grew up, the street that had raised him before he became this. Money flowed in. Kellerman didn't get rich. He wasn't stupid enough to change his lifestyle, but the accounts accumulated. $4,800 per month, enough to matter. Enough to feel like compensation for the judgment of men who didn't understand him. What Kellerman did not know was that an FBI financial crimes unit in Nashville had been tracking the Brightstone payment trails for 11 months. They had bank records, LLC registrations, wire transfers that traced back through shell companies and Delaware addresses to Kellerman's network. They were 3 weeks from arrest. They had everything they needed except one clean, final piece of evidence. One specific directed detention. One case where they could prove he had ordered an arrest specifically to feed the Brightstone pipeline. He was going to hand them that piece of evidence himself. He just didn't know it yet. 2 weeks before the morning on Sycamore Lane, Marci had filed a noise complaint against a neighbor. His name was Derek. He was Kellerman's brother-in-law. He rented a house 4 streets over, and had for the 3rd time in a month been running power tools past 10 o'clock at night. The noise echoed through the quiet street. It violated the peace that Marci had moved here to find. She had reported it through the proper channels. Standard procedure. The complaint had been logged, filed, routed through the system. It was bureaucratic, impersonal, and correct. Kellerman saw it differently. He saw it as a challenge. He saw it as a black woman telling him that his family was wrong. He saw it as disrespect. He saw it as something that required a response. He saw it as an opportunity. The response came 2 weeks later. Kellerman bought a prepaid phone from a gas station 2 counties over. He paid cash. He drove the phone to a location far enough away that the cellular triangulation would be messy. He filed an anonymous tip. The tip was about 1408 Sycamore Lane. It alleged immigration violations. It alleged documentation fraud. It alleged that the resident was in the country illegally. It alleged things that Kellerman invented, that Kellerman knew were false, that Kellerman crafted specifically because he knew they would trigger an immediate federal response. He filed it on a Thursday afternoon. By Tuesday morning, ICE had a warrant. What Kellerman did not know was that the FBI was watching him. Not him specifically, not yet, but watching Brightstone, watching the money flows, watching the arrests he directed. When Kellerman filed that anonymous tip from his prepaid phone, the FBI's Nashville field office pinged the cellular data. When Kellerman made the arrest, the FBI was going to have one more piece of the puzzle, one more piece of evidence, one more thread in a conspiracy that was about to unravel his entire life. Marci heard the first SUV turn onto Sycamore Lane. Just sound, just the mechanical noise of an engine, the specific pitch of tires on asphalt. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have alarmed her. But she had trained herself to notice everything, and her body noticed before her mind did. Something shifted in her shoulders, something tightened in her chest. The second SUV arrived, and there was no reason for 2 government vehicles on a dead-end street at 6:47 in the morning. There was no reason unless something was wrong, unless something official was happening, unless someone had decided that something about this street, about this house, about the woman in this house, required federal attention. The third pulled up, and her 23 years of training activated the way it always did. Not with panic, but with crystal clarity. Not with fear, but with assessment. She recognized the formation. She recognized the purpose. She recognized it because she had taught it. She set down her trowel. She brushed the dirt from her knees. She walked to her porch steps without hurrying, without the artificial calm of someone trying to seem calm. She moved the way trained soldiers move, with purpose, with efficiency, with the understanding that panic was useless and composure was survival. She climbed the steps. She picked up her coffee mug from the railing where she had left it. She took one slow sip, still warm. Good. She had learned long ago that small comforts mattered. Then she looked down her driveway. 4 black Chevy Suburbans. They had arranged themselves in perfect containment formation. One blocking the driveway mouth, one blocking the cul-de-sac exit. 2 pulled diagonally across the street in an X pattern that prevented escape in any direction. It was the formation she had designed. It was the formation she had taught to operators whose names were now on a wall in Virginia. A wall maintained by the Defense Department. A wall that listed the names of the people who had died so that America could sleep at night. She looked at that formation and she felt something settle into her shoulders like a heavy coat. Not fear. She had learned in her 20s that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not panic. Panic was for people who didn't understand what was happening. She understood. She understood perfectly. She understood that someone had decided she did not belong here. She set the coffee cup back on the railing. She placed her hands palms forward, where everyone could see them. She was completely still, waiting, the way she had waited in places where waiting meant the difference between life and death. The agents emerged from the vehicles in formation, professional, military adjacent, trained to move together, to create presence, to communicate without words that they represented federal authority, and that resistance was pointless. Marci had taught this exact movement to men who were now commanding officers. She had taught it because it worked. It showed force without violence. It communicated inevitability. It told the target that they had already lost, that the only choice remaining was how they would lose. She recognized every element of it, the spacing between agents, the angle of their approach, the way their hands hung near their weapons, the way the supervisor, a gray-haired man with a crew cut, stepped forward with the confidence of complete certainty. He had no idea that the woman watching him had spent the last 23 years reading men exactly like him. He had no idea that she could profile him with the accuracy of a computer. He had no idea that before he ever opened his mouth, she understood his psychology completely. He was a man high on his own authority. He was a man who had been told no once too often, and had decided that the next time someone told him no, he would respond with overwhelming force. He was a man who had convinced himself that the badge made him better than other people, smarter than other people, superior to other people. He was a man who was about to make the most expensive mistake of his life. The agents approached the porch. The supervisor Kellerman stepped out in front. He had his hand resting on the butt of his service weapon, an intimidation tactic, a message, a promise of what would happen if she didn't comply. Marci stood completely still. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't beg or question or plead. She simply stood and watched him the way she had watched enemies through her career. The way she had watched men who believed themselves untouchable before they were no longer untouchable. Marci Ellington. One of the agents called her name. His voice was procedural. He was following a script, and they both knew it. She didn't answer for a moment. She let the silence extend just long enough that it became uncomfortable. Then she said yes. "We have a warrant for your arrest on immigration charges." The agent continued. "Undocumented status. Document fraud. You are to come with us." She said nothing. She raised her hands higher, palms forward, making herself completely non-threatening. But when she did it, when she made that movement, Kellerman's face shifted. Something flickered across his expression. He had expected fear. He had expected compliance tinged with panic. He had expected the standard victim response. Instead, he got a woman who was so calm that it almost seemed like sadness. Like she was looking at something small and sad that she already understood. That was the moment the surveillance cameras caught. That was the moment that would 11 months later be played for a jury. That was the moment that showed without any doubt that this was not a case about immigration status. This was a case about the abuse of federal authority. Marci was placed in an ICE holding facility. She was asked questions, standard questions. Her immigration status, valid. Her documentation, legitimate. Her entry to the country, legal. Hours passed. There were no answers to the charges. There was no fraud. There was no undocumented status. There was nothing except the fact of her arrest. One of the agents, younger than the others, not yet comfortable with the machinery of detention, finally said something. "I think there's been a mistake." But Kellerman had already left. He was already counting money that didn't exist yet. Already planning how he would spend the payment from Brightstone Holdings. Already convinced that he had done his job and done it well. He had arrested someone. It didn't matter that the charges were false. It didn't matter that the warrant was fabricated. It mattered only that he had demonstrated his power, that he had shown that he could make someone disappear, that he could make the federal machinery respond to his will. Jasmine called her mother's house at 2 p.m. No answer. She called again. Again. Nothing but the sound of a phone ringing in an empty house. Jasmine drove to Willow Bend immediately. She drove fast, the way you drive when you know something is wrong. She arrived at her mother's house at 3:45 p.m. The front door was locked. The driveway was empty except for the Bronco. The house felt like a tomb. Panic tried to set in, but Jasmine had learned discipline from her mother. She breathed. She thought. She moved methodically through the house looking for any sign of what had happened. It took her 30 minutes to find it. Under the driver's seat of the Bronco, in a plastic waterproof case, was a laminated card. Jasmine pulled it out with shaking hands. The card was old. The edges were worn soft from years of being carried, from years of exposure to heat and cold and weather. On it was handwritten text, a name, a rank, a phone number, and one sentence that made Jasmine's hands shake so badly she could barely read it. The sentence said, "If something happens to me, call this number. The woman who saved my life is named Marci Ellington. Protect her like she protected us." The name on the card was General Marcus Webb. The rank was retired. The phone number belonged to someone Jasmine had never heard of, but her mother had kept that card under her seat for 23 years. At midnight, sitting on her mother's driveway in Memphis, Jasmine dialed. The phone rang once, twice. It was 12:47 in the morning, and she was calling a number she didn't know, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. A man answered on the third ring. His voice was alert, professional. The voice of someone who had spent a lifetime never allowing sleep to completely claim him, who was always ready for the call that meant action was required. "General Webb." Jasmine said his name. "Yes," he answered. My name is Jasmine Ellington. My mother is Marci Ellington. She gave me your card and told me to call if something happened to her. Something has happened. There was a silence, a long silence. The kind of silence that happens when someone's past walks directly into their present, and suddenly everything they thought was behind them is very much in front of them again. Where is she? Webb asked. I don't know. She was arrested this morning. Federal agents, ICE. I can't find her. I don't know what charges they're saying. I just know she's gone. Another silence. Then Webb said, don't move. I'm making calls. Stay by the phone. By 1:30 a.m., Webb had made 7 phone calls to people he hadn't spoken to in years. People who had served with him. People who had served with Marci. People who understood what it meant when someone called because Marci Ellington needed help. By 3 a.m., federal attorneys had been briefed. By sunrise, everything had shifted. The FBI's Nashville Financial Crimes Unit received a call. The person calling was Webb's legal team. The message was simple but seismic. Your target just arrested one of 7 women ever cleared for Delta Force-level operations. The significance of that statement took the unit chief about 5 seconds to fully comprehend. When it did, he went still. Kellerman hadn't just arrested someone. Kellerman had weaponized federal authority against a protected asset. Kellerman had fabricated charges against a person with the kind of security clearance that meant her freedom was essential to national security. Kellerman had, in a single act of arrogance and corruption, escalated his crimes from bribery and embezzlement to conspiracy against a federal service member. What had been simple corruption became something much larger. What had been individual misconduct became institutional abuse. What had been a 3-week investigation became a full federal response. The FBI pulled Kellerman's communications from the last 2 weeks. They obtained warrants. They accessed his prepaid phone records. They traced the anonymous tip back to him through cellular metadata, GPS data, historical timeline reconstruction. They opened his personnel file. 14 excessive force complaints in 6 years, 9 of them involving minorities, all dismissed. All settled quietly by union lawyers who understood that their job was to protect the people wearing the badge, not the people wearing the marks from that badge. This time there was a general officer on the phone. This time there was a woman with the kind of security clearance that meant her arrest was a matter of national security concern. This time the standard protections didn't apply. They opened Kellerman's financial records. They found the shell companies. They found the payment trails. They found the money flowing from Brightstone Holdings into 4 Delaware LLCs. They found a conspiracy that extended far beyond one officer and one arrest. General Marcus Webb, 32 years in the military, retired with highest honors, activated his network. He called federal prosecutors. He called people in Congress. He called media outlets. He called civil rights organizations. He provided Marci's complete service record. Sealed, classified, deeply compartmentalized. He verified her status with documentation that most people would never be allowed to see. He described in terms that were true but not specific the nature of her service, and the reasons why her freedom mattered to more than just her family. He transformed Marci from an anonymous defendant into a protected federal witness, from a woman who could be detained quietly into a matter of national security concern. By the time Marci had been in custody for 48 hours, the entire federal machinery had pivoted. The case was no longer about her immigration status. The case was about Kellerman. The case was about Brightstone Holdings. The case was about a system of corruption that had been operating in plain sight for years, while people in power pretended not to notice. Detective Sarah Wright of the Nashville field office opened Kellerman's phone records and felt her pulse quicken. The text messages were explicit, direct, incriminating. Kellerman to a Brightstone administrator. Need this arrest today. Metro towing contract requirements. Kellerman to other officers. Easy pickings. Midlothian corridor. Soccer moms don't lawyer up. Kellerman to an unknown number. Lang wants 12 stops this week. Midlothian is easy pickings. The evidence was so clear, so undeniable, that Wright had to read it twice to make sure it was real. This wasn't the careful corruption of someone trying to hide. This was the explicit conversation of someone who thought they were untouchable, who thought the system existed to protect them, who thought the people they targeted didn't matter enough to fight back. The financial audit by the city controller added another layer. Metro Towing had paid $680,000 to the city in contracts over 3 years. Kickbacks totaling $139,000 had been distributed through the shell companies. Kellerman's brother-in-law owned the storage lot rented by Metro Towing for $120,000 over 3 years. This wasn't individual corruption. This was institutional design. This was a system where officers were given quotas. where certain neighborhoods were targeted, where specific demographics were considered easy pickings, where money flowed from the people being arrested to the people doing the arresting, and the system protected everyone who benefited from that arrangement. 23 women had been targeted, 63 stops across multiple years, 89% Black or Latina, all in the same neighborhoods, all in neighborhoods where the housing values were lower, where the residents were less likely to have lawyers, where the system understood it could operate with impunity. Marci spent 47 days in federal detention. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She didn't panic or demand or beg. She did what soldiers do when they're captured. She studied the guards. She noted their patterns. She observed the weak points in the procedures. She documented everything in her mind, because you never knew when information would become important. Her cellmate was a young woman named Rosa, maybe 22, facing deportation. Terrified of what would happen to her, Rosa had been arrested in an ICE raid in the exact same pattern, stopped without cause, detained without sufficient evidence, processed through the machine. Marci didn't offer her sympathy. Sympathy was useless. Instead, she taught her how to breathe, how to center, how to understand that the most powerful thing a person could be was steady, how to understand that fear was a tool that the system used, and the way to defeat it was to refuse to be afraid. "How are you so strong?" Rosa asked her one night. Marci looked at the young woman and understood that Rosa needed something different than strength. She needed hope. She needed to believe that endurance mattered, that staying steady mattered, that refusing to break was a kind of victory that the system couldn't take from you. "I learned a long time ago," Marci said, "that staying steady is the most powerful thing a person can be." General Webb contacted every major news outlet. He didn't violate classified information. He didn't break his oath, but he made clear, in terms that were both vague and unmistakable, that Marci Ellington was no ordinary defendant. The Washington Post ran the story on day 43. ICE supervisor arrested federal service member on false charges. The headline made it clear that this wasn't about immigration. This was about the abuse of federal authority against a woman with credentials that demanded protection. By day 45, justice for Marci was trending on social media. Civil rights organizations issued statements. The ACLU filed amicus briefs. Congressional representatives called for hearings. Kellerman's attorney, understanding that the union had abandoned his client, began negotiating. By day 47, Marci was released on her own recognizance. No bail required. No conditions. The federal machinery had pivoted completely. The arrest warrant was quietly dismissed. The charges were quietly withdrawn. The government issued a statement expressing regret for any inconvenience. It was bureaucratic language. It was the way the system apologized when it had been caught. But it meant that Marci could go home, facing RICO charges, facing federal prosecution with no union protection, facing a conspiracy charge that carried up to 20 years. Kellerman's attorney requested a deal. Kellerman admitted everything. He admitted to the corruption. He admitted to the bribery. He admitted to directing arrests specifically to the Brightstone facilities in exchange for payments into the shell companies. He admitted to falsifying the arrest warrant. He admitted to filing the anonymous tip from his prepaid phone. He admitted to targeting Marci specifically because she had filed a noise complaint against his brother-in-law. He admitted in a federal deposition that Marci Ellington had violated no law, crossed no border, committed no crime. He admitted that he had arrested her because he could, because he was angry, because his ego had been bruised by a woman who dared to report his family for making noise past 10 o'clock at night. The confession became part of the federal record. It became evidence. It became the final nail in a coffin that was already closed. The Richmond Federal Courthouse was packed beyond capacity. 53 people, 6 camera crews, all 9 council members present. The council chambers had been arranged for a hearing that would become the public accounting of a corruption that had been hidden behind federal authority and union protection for years. Chief Caldwell Byron stood in uniform. He wasn't present as a husband. He was present as the chief of police. He was present as a man who had spent months investigating his own department and finding rot deeper than he had imagined. He presented the evidence with clinical precision. The body camera footage from the morning of Marci's arrest, Kellerman's aggression, his certainty, his absolute conviction that the woman on the porch would comply immediately, and Marci's response, complete calm, hands raised, no resistance, no panic. Just the bearing of someone who understood exactly what was happening and had decided she would not give Kellerman the satisfaction of seeing fear. The jury saw that footage. The jury understood in that moment that this was not a case about immigration status. This was a case about the abuse of federal authority. The financial records were displayed. The payment trails. The shell companies. The money flowing from a private detention contractor to officers of the law. The evidence was overwhelming. The evidence was undeniable. The evidence was the kind of evidence that would eventually rebuild the case into something much larger than Kellerman himself. 23 women gave testimony. Each one had a story of being stopped without cause. Each one had been targeted in the specific neighborhoods where the quotas were being enforced. Each one had experienced the humiliation of federal authority being used as a tool of extraction rather than justice. Renee Caldwell spoke about being stopped 5 times. 5 times, all in the same neighborhood. All in neighborhoods where she was told her presence was suspicious. All because the quota needed to be met and her demographic fit the profile of an easy picking. Data doesn't measure my daughter's nightmares, Renee said. Data doesn't explain to my child why a police officer decided that her mother was worth stopping. Data doesn't show what it does to a person to be told repeatedly that they don't belong. Other women spoke. Marissa Williams spoke about teaching respect for authority while living in a community where authority did not respect her. LaToya Johnson spoke about missing her son's birthday because of a quota. Kendra Anderson spoke about being asked to recite the alphabet backwards to justify a sobriety test she didn't need to take. Each woman added another layer to the picture of what the corruption looked like from the outside. Not as financial crime, not as embezzlement, but as the violation of human dignity on a scale that affected entire communities. General Marcus Webb took the stand in dress uniform. It was the first time he had appeared publicly since his retirement. It was a choice that carried meaning. It was a statement that what had happened to Marci mattered enough to bring him out of privacy. Webb described Marci's service in terms that were true but not specific. He described her dedication. He described the nature of her clearance. He described what it meant that she had been trusted with responsibilities that most people would never even know existed. This woman was weaponized by a man too small to understand what she is, Webb said. And the gallery went absolutely silent. You can prosecute one officer, or you can dismantle the system that created him. I suggest you do both. Marci stood to address the court. She didn't perform emotion. She didn't demand revenge or justice. She simply spoke truth with the kind of clarity that comes from having already processed the injustice and moved past rage. I moved to Tennessee to finally be safe, she said, to finally find a place quiet enough to stop listening for danger. Rory Kellerman decided I didn't belong here. He decided that a black woman on a quiet street was threat enough to justify federal authority being used against me. He was wrong. She looked at the 23 other women who had been targeted. Your voices matter. Your refusal to stay silent matters. The fact that you're here, that you're speaking, that you're refusing to disappear, that matters. She looked at Judge Crenshaw. Justice doesn't always come fast, but it comes when people refuse to look away. Judge Crenshaw took 1 week. When she returned to the bench, she carried sentences that reflected the scope of the conspiracy. 24 years in federal prison for Kellerman, the maximum possible under sentencing guidelines, civil forfeiture orders that seized his pension, asset freezes that left him with nothing. You arrested a soldier on her own porch, Judge Crenshaw said. You abused federal authority. You victimized 23 women. You deserve to be exactly where you're going. She read the ordinances that would restructure the department. Mandatory body cameras, banned quotas, civilian review board with subpoena power, annual bias training, annual audits of stop data, all of it written into law, all of it designed to make sure that what happened to Marci and the 23 women couldn't happen again. Kellerman was transferred to FCY Butner in North Carolina. Inmate number 4, 7632-074. No visitors in the first 18 months. His wife filed for divorce 7 months after his sentencing. His name was removed from the field office honor plaque in Willow Bend. Brightstone Holdings lost its federal contract within 11 days. The facility where Marci had been held was converted by federal order into Veterans Transitional Housing, funded partially by the civil forfeiture from Kellerman's assets. 61 beds. Run by a retired Army chaplain. Marci visited the facility twice. She placed her hand on the memorial plaque bearing 19 names, men she had served with. Men whose names were honored there because Marci's arrest had been transformed into something that actually mattered to the community. Derek Kellerman's brother-in-law, who had started the entire chain of events with his noise complaint, moved out of Willow Bend within 30 days. The house was rented to a young family with a dog. Harriet Donnelly, at 79 years old, was appointed chair of the Civilian Oversight Board. She wore her blue blazer to every meeting. She got her nails done before the first one and never stopped. She told Marci over sweet tea on the porch that she considered the whole affair to be the most interesting thing that had happened to her since the Nixon administration. Cody Baxter received a journalism scholarship funded by the Civil Settlement. His first published piece in the university newspaper was a profile of Emmett Hawkins, the retired postal worker. Emmett had it framed. It hung between the Tennessee Volunteers calendar and the picture of his wife at the Grand Canyon in the garage where he spent most of his time. Jasmine graduated nursing school. She took a pediatric nursing position at Willow Bend General. She moved her things from Memphis to her mother's guest bedroom on a Sunday in February without making any announcement about it. She arrived with 3 suitcases and a mattress strapped to the roof of her car. And at the kitchen table, Marci had said, "All right, Peanut," and neither of them had needed to say anything else. On a warm morning in late April, with the maple tree in full red bud and the tomato bed needing attention, Marci was on her knees in the garden when she heard the screen door open. Jasmine came down the porch steps in jeans and a plain t-shirt, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. They were the same mugs as before. "Mama," Jasmine said. "They're starting to arrive." Marci stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, took the coffee. They came up the sidewalk in the unhurried way of people coming to something that is not a party and not a ceremony, but something in between. Something that doesn't have a name because it doesn't need one. Harriet in her blue blazer. Emmett in his cap with a covered dish that turned out to be peach cobbler. Cody with his parents. The Castanedas, the new family in one of the houses down the street who had been told nothing about what had happened except by the quality of attention the neighbors paid each other, which had told them everything. Pastor Williams, 4 men in civilian clothes who had driven from as far as Virginia and Florida, men who had served at various times and in various capacities with a woman who had once told them what to do, and had been in the doing of it responsible for the fact that they were here to drive anywhere at all. Nobody brought cameras. Nobody made speeches. At one point, without consulting each other, the 4 men walked to the folding chair on the front lawn where Marci had placed her uniform jacket. The oldest of them, a white-haired former command sergeant major who had driven 11 hours to be there, picked it up in both hands and held it for a moment. Then he snapped off a salute. The other 3 followed. Marci on the porch with her coffee returned it from where she stood. That was the ceremony. The peach cobbler was finished before noon. The neighbors went home slowly in the southern way with many partial departures and reconsiderations. By 11, the lawn was empty. The maple leaves turned in the small wind. Up the street, a lawnmower started. A child laughed somewhere. A delivery truck went by without slowing. Jasmine sat in the other rocking chair. They were quiet for a while. A cardinal landed on the porch railing, considered them, and left. "Mama," Jasmine said. "Are you okay?" Marci looked at the street. She looked at the maple tree. The gold star sticker on the Bronco in the driveway. The front walk where the grass had grown back long ago and was now indistinguishable from the rest of the lawn. She thought about a cold concrete cell and a fluorescent light that didn't turn off, and a fist pressed once quietly against the wall. She thought about Terrell, the 20-year-old boy who had made her promise to protect his sister, who had died in service so that Marci could come home. She thought about a laminated card under a car seat, and a daughter who had found it, and a phone call made at midnight on a driveway. She thought about a man who had come to her street to remind her that she did not belong here, and who was now sitting in a federal facility in North Carolina. Inmate number 47632-074, with no visitors and no pension and no badge, and plenty of time to think about the address he had driven to that morning. And the name he had decided did not matter. "I'm home, Peanut," she said. "Okay, Mama," Jasmine answered. And on Sycamore Lane, where a woman had once moved into a brick house on a dead-end cul-de-sac and braced quietly for the stares the neighbors stayed on their porches long after there was any reason to. Because that was the kind of street it had become. Because some truths, once learned the hard way, tend to stay learned. The badge was never the armor. It was always supposed to be the oath. When a man forgets the difference, he builds brick by brick in every act of cruelty he mistakes for authority. The exact cell he will eventually occupy. Rory Kellerman thought he was untouchable on a quiet Tennessee street. He learned from the wrong end of a federal indictment that the only truly untouchable thing is a woman who has already survived the worst thing, and decided quietly to stay standing. 2 questions for you. Was 24 years enough for a man who used a federal badge against a gold star mother on her own porch? Or should Judge Crenshaw have given him the maximum possible sentence? And if you were Jasmine sitting on that driveway at midnight with your mother's handwriting on a laminated card in your shaking hands, would you have had the steadiness to dial that number? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. Next week, a retired Black Marine Master Gunnery Sergeant walks into his own VFW hall on a Friday night and is told in front of 30 men he served alongside for 26 years that he is in the wrong place. He doesn't argue. He sits down. He orders a beer. And then the door opens. Subscribe our channel so you don't miss it. Hit the like button if you want more stories like this one. Stay safe out there. And remember, some doors really aren't meant to be kicked in.